Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Healthpath podcast. Today's guest is Daniel DeBaun from Defender Shields, and the topic of today's episode is all about electromagnetic radiation. I asked Daniel to help us understand what this term actually is, and we also dive into some of the known and suspected mechanisms that explain why electromagnetic radiation can be problematic to human health, especially for those with electrohypersensitivity. We discuss how this is not some form of woo-woo science. The World Health Organization even acknowledge electrohypersensitivity these days. And Daniel goes into some of these mechanisms that includes the cell danger response, the fact that radiation has a sort of immunosuppressive property to it, that it seems to impact the microbiome, that things like cell phones seem to impact the blood-brain barrier, contributing to leaky blood-brain barrier, a similar concept to leaky gut. And then we spend the second half of the episode discussing things that we can do to reduce our exposure. Some of this is absolutely common sense, but I really hope that today's conversation reinforces that we should be doing these things consistently, and there are certain things that can make this easier and more convenient as well. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this episode with you guys. As always, we appreciate any feedback and any positive reviews that you're happy to leave us on your podcast provider. If you prefer to watch today's conversation, then head over to our YouTube channel, which is just Healthpath, and you can check out the video there. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be back very soon with another episode, but for now, here is my conversation with Daniel DeBaun. I hope you enjoy. Okay, Daniel, welcome to the Healthpath podcast, and thank you for staying some time to come and speak with me.
Alex, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm just excited about chatting with your audience about a subject I'm pretty passionate about, electromagnetic radiation. So thank you again.
No, thank you. And I think, it's an area that I think a lot of people are becoming more aware of.
Yes.
It's an area that certainly some of our customers are particularly interested in, with sort of certain degrees of hypersensitivity. So I think it's a really important conversation. And I guess before we dive into it, Daniel, are you happy just to share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and your background?
Of course. Actually, for the bulk of my job experiences, I actually worked in Bell Laboratories, which is a research and development lab in the U.S., and they drove the telecommunications network, and I was part of the telecommunications. I used to do the standards for the industry, including the telephone networks that are in place now. And I used to test the technology to make sure they complied to what the standards were. So I had a whole bunch of experience in telecommunications. And that is a primary source of electromagnetic radiation. So it turns out probably about 15 years ago or so, my boys were visiting, and they had their laptops in their lap for literally hours at a time. And my wife says intuitively, that can't be good. I want grandchildren. That at your groin area is dangerous. And I said to my wife, you don't understand. The power levels are too low. There's no way it's going to influence the cells, blah, 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 blah. But because I was in the research side of Bell Labs, I sort of thought about it a little bit. I said, well, let me go check the medical community. And even at that time, Alex, it turned out that after about 3 to 4 hours, the male sperm was 25% of the male sperm was erratic and immobile in some cases. That was sort of surprising information. I was in telecom my whole life, and I did not know that that was true. And then, of course, I looked into it a little bit more, and I also found at that time that females had tumors, huge population. Most of the time, it was non-cancerous tumors, but some in their groin area became cancerous. So I So I was just amazed that that was true. And so I actually developed shielding for my boys. And I asked them to use it, and they did, and their friends liked it, so they wanted shielding as well. And then we got asked about cell phones, and there was a story back at that time where a 16-year-old child used a cell phone, and within a year she had frontal lobe cancer. That's anecdotal. It's not statistical. There's no real evidence that that's true, that all of us can in science accept. But man, that really bothered me because I suspected, and there was evidence even back then that those kinds of things could happen. And so we started building shielding for cell phones. So we got really involved very early on, and began becoming a focal point for people to learn a little about electromagnetic radiation, where it came from, how it affects the body. And we became subject matter experts. Not that we wanted to do that, but it turns out that not many experts were available. And so I had a background in technology, so it was not too much of a difficult transition for me, but we actually became the source of a lot of people's answers for subject matter that no one really understood. That's how I got in, Alex.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess, that for me brings up the question of just laying the groundwork here around what is electromagnetic radiation, what is EMFs. People have kind of heard of this term. So are you happy just to really lay down the...
Absolutely. I'll relate it back to when I was in Bell Labs, which was quite a number of years ago. We had mainframes, these huge pieces of equipment, and they operated our computing infrastructure. And these machines, they put off loads and loads of emissions, but it was 500 feet away from me. It was really far away. In fact, most technologies as recently as 10 years was mostly away from us. But all of a sudden, those technologies that were becoming smaller and smaller were getting closer and closer to our bodies. And today, for example, 98% of the world's population, or the US population, has cell phones. And 6-year-old children are using cell phones. And all of a sudden, what used to be far away is really, really close. And there's scientific evidence that that closeness of these electronics can be bothersome. So what do we mean? Your refrigerator, your microwave oven, your hair dryer, all of these products emit extremely low frequency radiation. That's what they call it. And then you have a cell phone that has a Wi-Fi transmitter on it. It has a Bluetooth transmitter on it. It has a cell phone transmitter on it. There's 3 different transmitters transmitting from a cell phone, and you have it right next to your head. This is unprecedented. It hasn't happened in the past, but it's certainly very much a part of our lives today.
Mm. And I think at least some of our listeners might be aware of, the kind of anecdotal, I guess, research and evidence around things like phone towers and, people living around these areas.
Alex, it turns out that there's many studies actually that I'm familiar with about the overhead wires, the high tension overhead wires. If you take a fluorescent light bulb, you can almost light it up. In many cases, it will light up because there's so much energy being transmitted from those heavy duty wires. And so that is clearly, when you're close to these devices, is a problematic. And the cell towers themselves, they produce a lot of power. And those transmitting long distances, up to 5 miles, in fact. And it turns out that if you're within 1,000 feet, you're 3 times more likely to have 3 times more likely to have cancer, and a variety of sources, as is the case with power lines. So we know that when you're close to these things, from the studies we've seen, that there is an impact to the cell of the body.
Okay. And why is that? I guess a question that might be coming for people who are new to this information is, how are these kind of emissions, and how is this kind of electromagnetic connection to the human body?
So there are some scientists that actually Dr. Powell is one of them. He shows how the cell itself gets weakened from the constant load hitting them from the outside. Weakening actually allows calcium to penetrate into the cell. And when that happens, there are chemical reactions and the cell mutates potentially. The cell is disrupted, and that becomes the source of potential cancer. It's the same way when you have an X-ray, by the way. It's just a different way of happening, the different pathways of it. The second way it happens is like, when you see a bear in the woods, you run, right? The reason you run is because all of your ancestors for all those years knew you better run when you see a bear. Well, guess what? Your body does the same thing. It's just you're not thinking about it. They refer to it as cell danger response. Cell danger response is where the body says, wow, I'm being attacked by any toxin. It can be gas toxins like gasoline. It can be perfume. You may be smelling perfume and you may be bothered. In all these cases, they call it cell danger response. It's a biological response that has been from day one of our lives. And so when that happens, there is things that occur in the body that are unnatural or defensive. And some of this can be pretty serious. It can be debilitating, and it could be considered electrohypersensitivity, where you really get, when you're near a Wi-Fi, you get upset, you get a headache maybe, or maybe your eyes hurt a little bit. And so you have those kinds of things. But it's also true, Alan, when you're close to Wi-Fi, or when you're close to a cell phone or a tablet or a laptop, they generate RF signals, as we were just talking, and it also affects immune. Your immune system is, believe it or not, suppressed with these emissions coming into your body. In fact, it can get so bad that, like your gut, we know from clinical work that we work with that there's a bacterium, a DebC, which is called, and it's elevated bacterium that can be very dangerous. So we know the body's physically reacting to the environment it's around, and it's automatic, and the body does it by its own.
Okay, amazing. So we've got an immunosuppressive sort of mechanism. We've got the leakage of calcium. We've got the cell danger response, this kind of primal immune response.
Yeah, and additionally, when you have a blood-brain barrier that protects your brain, that's suppressed when you're using cell phones really close. So what does that mean? More toxins get into the inner part of your brain, having foggy thinking, not clear, tensions, stress, depression, memory, concentration problems, fatigue. There are so many different things, headaches. A lot of people don't associate headaches with the Wi-Fi, but in fact, that's the source potentially. So you really do need to know your environment so you avoid some of these aches and pains and problems with your body.
Sure. And I guess a question that came up to me earlier is, do we understand why people, or some people, are more sensitive to this? Because, the World Health Organization have acknowledged electrohypersensitivity. And I think that's important to say, because some people still see this as kind of quite out there.
You're absolutely right. In Europe, it's very well accepted problem. In the US, it is not. Really interesting. But to your point you just made, more than a growing number, greater than 20% of the human population is what is referred to as electrohypersensitive. We know that from many studies. And do you know what? 80% of that are women. And we have no idea why. Science does not know why women, some speculate it's hormonal differences, brain differences, but there's not enough study for us really to really conclude emphatically what's the source of why women than men. We really don't know. So electrohypersensitive is a problem worldwide, and it is growing, correlated to the introduction of technology surrounding us more and more every day.
Okay. It is really fascinating. And I guess you've mentioned some of the sort of cognitive and brain consequences. We've spoken about how it's kind of immunosuppressive. Are there any other areas of health or health risks that we can kind of just highlight?
Well, one of the ones that I often talk about and stress is the tension, depression, stress environment. With the RF signals in a classroom, for example, the Wi-Fi, there seems to be a much accelerated rate of anxiety and depression with kids. And we do have studies that show a correlation, but certainly not sufficient evidence to conclude that is absolutely a correlated problem. But it's real, and you'll hear me talk about this. Even though we need to know more, it's not a bad idea to think about your environment and how you minimize those exposures, because they do seem to have a lot of impact. You mentioned something about understanding the problem before or not. Well, it turns out that in the US, probably 10 years ago or so, the federal government did an epidemiology study, and the National Toxicity Program within the government spent $30 million, and they did this huge statistically significant epidemiology study. And there was clear evidence of elevated cancer and tumor in the frontal lobe of the body from an RF signal, cell phone signal, as well as with the heart. That's the case because it's soft tissue. It's like some of the softer tissues of the body seem to be impacting more than your muscles or your bones. And then more recently, the Ramazzani Institute out of Italy did a similar epidemiology study. And believe it or not, they found the same identical results. In other words, epidemiology has been around for hundreds of years. It is how we typically focus in on what our environment is and what it's not. And for many of us in the science space, that reinforced to us that the trending seems the things we think we see probably correlate pretty well with the epidemiology. So it is more serious than publicly known.
And people might be asking sort of around these mechanisms. And I think something that people don't often think about the human body is that we are kind of electric.
Right, exactly.
It makes sense that sort of electric environment and the different emissions that are being emitted by the technology is going to impact that.
There's no question about it. And remember when I talked about Dr. Powell's study? What weakens the cell is the communications between the cells, the electrical current between the cells. It dampens that communications. Where it's normally occurring, it's disrupted, weakened, and that's what enables the calcium to penetrate the cells. It's that weakened electrical communications infrastructure of the cell, of the body.
Okay. And that reminds me, I'm not sure who the researcher is, but I've read it now a couple of times around someone who measured sort of the voltage of cells and cancerous cells compared to people who are just chronically ill with chronic fatigue syndrome and things. And I guess they showed that correlation between the voltage of the cell and kind of the health of the person, ultimately.
Oh, no question about it. I'll reinforce that. When I'm aware of several clinics that look for the current flow within the frontal lobe. And when you have depression, there's a correlation between the flow within that part of the brain. So if it's less than it should be, that's correlated to a depression or an anxiety. And so, yes, we've been able to correlate that along with under stress from Wi-Fi, for example. They typically use Wi-Fi to show that correlation to the frontal lobe and then measuring that frontal lobe. And in fact, with electric hypersensitive, you can actually find ways of improving that by doing certain things with your body, moving away from it and a bunch of other things.
Okay, yeah, I definitely want to sort of spend the second half of today discussing some of the things for this.
And Alex, it's funny, and sort of, this is a station break sort of story. It's good basic health that helps you defend from your environment. And the RF signal, the cell phone, is one toxin. That's as much as a toxin as the chemicals in the air. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that sort of what often people refer to, I guess, as body burden, how much exposure is there and how well can we handle it. But
right.
Before we get on to that, I mean, I'm certainly interested to pick your brain around sort of 5G and how this kind of fits into all of this.
Okay, let's talk about that. Yeah, one of the things we have not talked about is some of the technical stuff. Let's talk a little bit about it. I won't be too deep. But when you have a cell phone, a hertz, 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second. It's a wave that goes in the air. When you have a cell phone, it's about 1 gigahertz. So the wave in the air is 1 billion cycles per second. Okay. When you have a router at 2.4 gigahertz, that's 2.4 billion cycles per second. So it keeps on getting faster and faster and faster. With 5G, you've heard of millimeter wave, maybe. It's just a continuation of a spectrum going faster and faster and faster. So what is a little concerning about 5G is that the spectrum goes far beyond what we've ever seen in the marketplace. So much of 5G, half of 5G is in the spectrum we already know. We know, for example, 2.4 gigahertz is very, very, very close to 2.3 gigahertz, which you use in a microwave oven. When you cook your meat in an oven, it's at 2.3 gigahertz. It's the same frequency rate, but it's much less power. But that's a thermal impact, a thermal. What we're really worried about, and what we mostly talked about, is the burning sensations, the tension, the depression. That's all biological impacts. And so science is concerned about the biological impacts of the very fast waves. So a lot of the stuff we see is in the same spectrum we've been in. We don't like it. We know it's impacting the body. But where the real concern is when it gets above 10 gigahertz, because most of the stuff in our environment is lower than 10 gigahertz. And guess what, Alex? There is zero study on the impact of that frequency into our environment. I've seen a few studies, very few, on 20 gigahertz, for example. Remember I talked about DevC and the gut? Mm. Well, the gut, bugs in your stomach like RF. They propagate. When I read the research on 20 gigahertz, which is now in the upper part of the 5G spectrum, the bugs like that too. So we know that we've had problems at the lower levels below 10 gigahertz, but we really it seems to suggest that from very limited studies, it's the same, if not worse, than where we are at the lower rates. And really, that's the debate. We just don't really know what the impact is. And you're talking about, like with 5G, up to 300 gigahertz, 300 billion cycles per second. And nobody knows anything about that. As a side note, 5G is led by 6G. 6G is up to 1 terahertz. Really, really, really fast. It's getting to be the point where it's like an X-ray or the sunlight. So we keep on introducing these signals that we don't know much about. And unfortunately, we're going to learn from practice what the implications are.
Mm. And you mentioned that bugs like, for example, 5G. What do you mean by that?
It likes the frequency. They resonate with the frequency. So it's really true that when you're next to an RF Wi-Fi, it could be disrupting your biome in your gut, right? Because the good bugs may like it and the bad bugs may like it. Okay. The DevC I mentioned before, which is an elevated biome marker that we look at, shows that they elevate. So that seems to be liking it more than the good bugs, which is not a good thing. It's a bad thing because now your biome's disrupted.
Mm. And I guess, that ties in with some of the mechanisms that we've already discussed around sort of the immune system and the sort of the suppressive nature of that and things.
Well, mitochondrial repair comes from the stomach, right? And you don't recover as much as you may be if it's a normal biome. And so there's implications over and over and over. Another point too, which we haven't spoke about, when you're looking at me right now in a monitor, your monitor is generating blue light. And I'm sure you've heard about this, but what does it really mean? This is what it means to the body. When you're looking at that blue light, that component is what tells you to go to sleep and wake up every day. So when you're looking at your screen at night, say 11 o'clock, just before you go to bed, that light is entering into your eye. And in the back of the eye, there's what is known as a cryptochrome protein. It's the little switch that turns the melatonin on and off. It stays on. And so the melatonin stays off and the melatonin never turns on. And you wonder why you can't go to sleep. Well, it's because the melatonin is not present in your bloodstream. So even that is a part of the modern digital world, is that we're looking at monitors all the time. We're seeing all these blue components of that spectrum hitting our eyes and disrupting our cycle. We have the 24-hour cycle that we maintain health of.
Yeah. Yeah, and that on its own right is huge. I think we've had some guests on recently talking about our circadian rhythm.
Circadian rhythms. Yeah, that's the point. Yeah. And in fact, so if you're doing that, you're not going to necessarily go to sleep when you want, and you're not eating good and within time windows. You've got multiple things going on in your body, and that disrupts even further your ability to retain and be resilient in these kinds of environments.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. So is there anything, Daniel, that you would like to kind of just touch on or expand on before we move into what we can do about this situation?
We know that our environment, what the World Health Organization considers RF a carcinogenic, a 2B carcinogenic. Arsenic is considered a carcinogenic, 2B carcinogenic. Gas fumes are considered a carcinogenic. So there are some parts of the world that recognize there's potential dangers. To be carcinogenic is it potentially can be carcinogenic. And so we know that, and when they did that study with the WHO organization, they didn't have sufficient evidence to make it a primary carcinogenic. With the studies that I mentioned before, the Ramazani Institute and National Toxicity Program, now there's epidemiology studies that are pretty substantive. So our guess is when the next time they meet, it will be elevated as a carcinogenic. In other words, it's pretty serious in your life. And so this is probably something you should be aware of and your family be aware of in time because it's changing. As an example of what that means, when in the US, when they developed the standard, what they decided was there can be a 1.6 watt per kilogram against the head and you'd be safe. When that standard was developed over 30 years ago, they only looked at the thermal impact, not the biological. And at that time, they used 6-foot males to establish that standard, as did Europe, by the way. And the standard was, we'll let the head increase in temperature by 2 degrees near the phone. And we'll let that signal penetrate 1 to 2 inches into that head. 6-foot male, big old cranium, lots of fat in between, defending the brain. 1 to 2 inches. So you have a child or a grandchild, you give them the phone, they're using it and twirl their grandma all the time. That same signal can go right through the head of that 6-year-old child. And again, what we've learned in science, we're not worried about the thermal impact. We're worried about the biological impact. And so when you're exposing your children at the very young ages with these cell phones, you have to try to restrict their time or not even use it if you can, because there's a penetration into their skulls that may have serious implications further in their lives. We just don't know fully.
Mm. So, yeah, I mean, I guess one of the strategies to improve our environment ultimately is limiting our exposure.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. Don't use it as much. That's it. Like if you use a cell phone a couple hours a day, you're considered a heavy user. By 10 years out, you're likely to have cancer, frontal lobe cancer. You're 3 times more likely to have cancer. 3 times.
Wow.
And when you're a heavy user. When you're a light user, there is no statistic that says that there's a serious impact. So we know that the more you use it, the more you're exposed, the more the probability is you'll have an impact to your body and cells of your body. So yes, avoid it. As simple as that, if you can. And go ahead, please.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation some of the I guess the household items that were missing some of these things. You mentioned the fridge, you mentioned the microwave. We a couple of years ago got rid of our microwave when we started looking into some of this. So are there any other kind of common household items that we just need to have on our list?
You have to control your environment. I typically talk about this as bees in the room. When 1 bee can kill you, if you're stung, 1,000 will. So the more devices you have in an environment, the worse it is.
Okay.
So the very, very first thing you should be thinking about in your environment is, are you using the Wi-Fi at night? If not, get a little power supply control and turn it off at night. So you reduce the exposure within the night. If you're going to use it during the day, try to put it someplace in the house where you're at least 10 foot away. The more you're away, the better you are when you use the devices. In fact, when you use a cell phone directly to the head, there's the maximum power level that's going into your body. If you remove it by 1 to 2 feet, 80% of the danger is gone. By 4 feet, 98% of the danger is gone. So by moving technology away from you when you're not using it, like your cell phone, you put it when you come into the house, right near the table in the house and go around the house, that's not going to bother anybody. So simple mechanical things like that really does help you reduce the number of bees in the room. With my cell phone, as an example, I have only my cell connection, and I never have it near me. And I've turned off the Bluetooth. I've turned off the Wi-Fi. I don't need them in my environment because I'm not using that with my cell phone. So anytime you can turn something off, you want to do that. Anytime you can wire something, you want to do that. For example, I have Ethernet connecting to my laptop. I would not use Wi-Fi. I have, but I don't typically use it often. I just reduced my use of it and I reduced the exposure to it.
Okay, perfect. And you say, some very simple things there in regards to hardwiring and just limiting use, turning Wi-Fi off at night. And, I think speaking to clients and also just looking at statistics on my Instagram account of my followers, you can see like the peak of when people are on social media on their phones is often in bed.
Right.
Sometimes people are on their phone for several hours a day. So this is like a really big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. There is no question that the use of our technology, we got to watch it. I'm going to circle back a tiny bit to the cyclic nature of the 24-hour cycle. When you eat in the morning and when you end at night, you shouldn't drift too much out of that window, as you know, Alex, right? You really want to make sure you're eating the right kind of well-balanced meals, and you want to make sure that your body's not working in overtime when you're trying to sleep, or it disrupts sleep. And so the circadian rhythm, believe it or not, is pretty important as a way of minimizing the exposures by increasing your resilience to that environment we're in. I'm going to break off a little bit and talk about something else right now because I think it's important.
Sure.
When you're sleeping, that's a sanctuary that you really want to take all toxins out of that you can. You never want Wi-Fi in. You never want cell phones in. You never want any devices that are transmitting signals in. I was on a podcast once and I had this really, really bright lady. And I said to her, you got to make sure you have the sanctuary and you move all these devices, as I just said. And she was like, oh, yes, thank you so much for that help. She didn't believe a word I said. And then about 2 weeks later, she calls me up and she said, my husband and I took our cell phones out of the bedroom. We put it in the other room and we're sleeping fully all night as a result of removing those RF signals into our environment. So you really do want to make sure that the sleep cycle is disrupted minimally, and you have RF signals coming out of these modern devices we have that disrupt that sleep or can disrupt that sleep. It doesn't necessarily do it to everyone.
And I've heard the recommendation of, pulling the bed away from the wall.
Oh, yeah. I don't want to complicate it too much, but remember I mentioned the extreme low frequency stuff, that the power lines outside, they run in your wall. Okay. And they generate a milligauss, which is a metric of exposure. And if you have a wire running in the wall that has current flow, there's a light somewhere. There's an emission that comes out of that wall, 5 to 10 milligauss. And so when you're close to that wall, you're being radiated from that wire that's inside that wall. And it doesn't sound like much, but if you're electric hypersensitive, it can be a lot. And so you're right. You really want to sort of think about turning the power off of all your devices that you can. and then positioning the bed a bit away from walls that may have the wiring inside those walls.
Okay. So just to summarize this, we've got turning Wi-Fi off at night, limiting our use of tech ultimately in the evenings, partly to reduce the exposure to these frequencies, but also just for good circadian rhythm.
Plus the blue light.
Yeah. We've got, I guess, considering some of our other things like fridges and microwaves. I mean, I think I saw one recommendation, which was, if you can have the fridge and freezer in sort of your garage, if you've got kind of a garage connected to things, or just kind of as getting these things away from your living environment to the best of your ability.
Right. Like a Wi-Fi. You can put your Wi-Fi in your garage. Everyone will be able to get access to it. What's nice about that is far away. So the power levels that are in your environment are much, much lower than they typically are if a Wi-Fi is in the room. Simple stuff to do, but have major implications into your environment. Yeah. The ambient essentially drops.
Okay. And can you touch on at all the concept of earthing or grounding, and can that provide a bit of a balance here at all?
Yes. I'll tell you a story. I was at a conference and I had this guy come up to me and talking to me about grounding. Of course, I ran laboratories. I'm pretty familiar with this stuff. So he was telling me how everything is perfect if you have a grounded floor. I said, that's not true. If you have a cell phone to your head, you're using it and you're grounded, it's literally doing nothing for you. So if you don't fix your environment to some extent, there's no benefit. It turns out that our bodies are a natural capacitor. It absorbs the static electricity around us. And if you put a pair of wool socks on and go over a rug and then touch a metal bar, you'll feel a little shock. That's where there's a discharge of that capacitance. And so when you're grounded and there's higher levels of electrical environment within your body, and you go on a grounding pad, it is actually really sort of pretty good for you because it's allowing you to take that excess and go to ground. That's literally what it's doing. It's literally going into the ground through those pads. So I believe that grounding pads are good, but you got to be careful that it's not excess, because you can have excessive capacitance draw, which actually becomes a negative for your body. And if you think you have a Wi-Fi next to your head and you're safe, it's absolutely wrong, because that signal is not being forced down to the pad, it's being forced to your head. So it's logical. You got to be practical about the benefit of it. And there is a benefit.
Sure. So just to see if I've understood that correctly, because obviously in the earthing narrative, we talk about how the body's absorbing electrons, and those electrons act as antioxidants and have a bit of an anti-inflammatory sort of property.
Right.
But you're saying that if we are on a sort of a grounding mat, for example, that actually we can offset some of that electricity.
Yes, benefit. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no question about it. In fact, one of the primary inventors of that was the guy I met at the conference. Boy, did he talk to the wrong guy, because he was telling me what the benefits were. And I said, yeah, they are, but it's not the panacea you're defining. You got to be careful with it, because you disrupt the body's own electrical infrastructure by mucking around with it a little bit too much. Like if you're electric hypersensitive, I always suggest you want to think about doing something like that, because we typically see that drain as a benefit. Okay. But it's also true that I wouldn't put anybody in a bed to sleep on a pad all night, because I would be concerned about the attraction of that energy into the room through your body into the ground. It's going through your body. It's not only going to the pad on the bed. And that's where you got to be careful.
That's really interesting. Okay. Yeah, that takes a whole new kind of spin and perspective on some of that stuff.
Yeah, you got to be careful about it. That guy who, I don't want to use names, he came to me and the following day and he says, I think you're right. we gotta think about what we're saying. And I said, you do.
Interesting. And obviously, you have for many years now, I guess, you mentioned the story of starting with your sons and creating some sort of protective material. So do you want to kind of expand on that side of things as well?
Yeah. For the first several years, as I had mentioned, we were becoming a conduit for questions in this space. What we realized was that we didn't have an understanding as a general public of really what the facts were and what the concerns should be. And so after a few years of coaching, we ended up writing a book, Radiation Nation. And in Radiation Nation, we talk about all these subjects and try to help identify what the facts are, the engineering facts, in a way that your grandmother would understand it. That was our intent. And we started with that so people could understand the space they're in and where they're going and what's fact and what's fiction. We have, as you may imagine, factions. This is a debate in the marketplace. And you have factions, service providers, that said there's absolutely no problem whatsoever. And then you have independent study that says we have serious concern. Well, which is the fact? No one could really understand the fact. So my son and I wrote Radiation Nation, and it was an education. So I always encourage people to look for something like that. There are a couple of books out there, including ours, that try to help understand what this environment is. And I always recommend that as a starting point.
Okay. And from the actual building of products to help protect us, how was that journey? What sort of material do we need to consider? Because I guess sometimes you see people, they have their laptop on a cushion, which is on their lap, for example. So distance is one of the things, I guess, that can vary.
A little bit, right. It is. Yeah. But in general, they're not shields. They don't prevent the signals from going through. And reducing technology impacts by providing distance or shielding helps you become resilient in the space you're in. So, as you were just mentioning, we did evolve our product lines from a laptop protection from my sons, and then a cell phone because of that story I told you about. And we keep on evolving these things to even earbuds. I use earbuds, which are acoustical earbuds. It's a tube that doesn't allow electrical signal to come up to the ear. And I eliminate completely any potential dangers from that by using this. Now you talk about shielding. It turned out that all shielding that we're aware of and any industry's aware of doesn't shield 5G at beyond 20 gigahertz. And so we started developing probably 3 years ago shielding materials that go up to 90 gigahertz right now. And we think we can get up to 300 gigahertz. So we've had the challenge of trying to keep pace with what the technology was doing with ways of protecting people with the devices we offer. Turns out, as an interesting side note, the military in the U.S. has become pretty interested in our stuff because electronic warfare is using RF signals. Believe it or not, right? You think about it. They use bursts of energy. They call it electromagnetic pulsing to destroy electronics. So all of a sudden, there are other dimensions in our modern environment that's changing, even for the military, and our shielding and our devices we create help those environments. So we did that. The other thing I did, which was I would get these phone calls from women, particularly, and they explain what they think is their environment. And I eventually found a way of listening and sort of characterizing it as electrohypersensitivity years ago. And so it really disturbed me that there weren't supplements that were directly targeting the electrohypersensitive, or for that matter, the digital environment we live in today. And so I mentioned to you cell danger response. Cell danger response is the work that was created by Dr. Navio in the US, in San Francisco, US. And he's a brilliant, brilliant man. He's looking at medicine in a more fundamental way, down to the cellular level. And I gave you a high level view of what that is, but he worked with finding mechanical ways of offsetting and building resilience in the human body. So we've been working, trying to interpret his work and bring supplements that solve some of the problems that we know exist for electrohypersensitive, and in general, people who are multiply chemically sensitive, and others who have immune problems. And believe it or not, the first thing I did was I did omega-3. Believe it or not, it's omega-3 is like a miracle drug in its pure form. So we actually went around the world to find sources of raw material that were the cleanest environments with short-lived lives. And we harvested the fish with cold processes. We never use chemicals. We never use oxidative approaches to reduce the efficacy of the materials we use. And the very first thing we came out with was omega-3, but it's pure omega-3. It is not, we don't add anything to it. It's pure omega. And pure omega, Dr. Navio used in some of his clinical work. And that stuff wasn't even as good as we use. We really went a far way to find the right source. And so we've started a light body production line of supplements which are intended for the modern environment. The eye, we actually can filter out blue light into the eye with a supplement. Huh. It literally just became available in the research side of that business. And so we went after the eye. The gut, I have a probiotic now that goes after that strain, the DebC strain, because I know it's likely true. If you're hypersensitive in any way, there's a reasonable chance you have elevated levels of DebC. And so I'm just really excited about those kinds of things because it helps your body in an environment that's changing and becoming more challenging for the human body. Eventually, our bodies will figure it out, right? 100 years from now, we'll know what to do. But in the meantime, it's going to be rough going.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point in regards to, there's that balance between limiting exposure and just accepting and acknowledging, as you say, this is just part of the environment. So
yeah, absolutely.
Getting as resilient as possible at the same time is needed fundamentally.
Alex, absolutely. There is no question about it. You're not going to throw your cell phone away. I'm not going to throw my cell phone away. So we have to find a balance in the use of our cell phones. So we're comfortable in an environment that's the modern environment. And there are so many practical things we can do to reduce those exposures. And by the way, don't worry about the stuff you can't control. Like people ask me about your neighbor. Should I have them turn their Wi-Fi? No, they're too far away. Don't worry about it. That's really not impacting you unless you're extremely hypersensitive, and some people are. But by and large, in general, a little bit of distance from these environments are typically low-level power levels, and you're pretty safe.
Okay, brilliant. I'm mindful of time, Daniel. So is there anything that you would like to conclude with? Anything you want to emphasize or?
Yeah, you're the architect of your own environment. You coach people how to maintain a healthy lifestyle. That is so important for the modern environment. And no one else is going to come along and turn off that router or move that router where it doesn't belong. Only you do. So if you're going to make those improvements, if those improvements are going to occur, it's not going to be legislatively done. It's going to be done through your own action. So you're the architect of your own destiny, and you should take the action to make sure you live in an environment that you choose.
Perfect. Wise words. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been really great to do a bit of a deeper dive into some of these things that we all need to be more aware of, I think.
Alex, thanks so much for inviting me. I did enjoy our conversation today. Thanks so much.
Okay, guys, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'm going to be back next time speaking with Marek Doyle again, who's making, I think, his third appearance now on the podcast. We are going to be talking about sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, and really bringing the previous conversations into a circuit, shall we say, where previously we've discussed adrenal function and thyroid function. Now it's time to incorporate the sex hormones into this picture as well. So I'm really looking forward to speaking with Marek again. He's certainly been a popular guest on the podcast. So stay tuned for the next episode with Marek. But until then, stay happy and healthy, and I'll speak to you all soon.